नमो ब्रह्मादिभ्यो ब्रह्मविद्या संप्रदायकर्तृभ्यो वंश ऋषिभ्यो महद्भ्यो नमो गुरुभ्यः। सर्वोपप्लवरहितः प्रज्ञानघनः प्रत्यगर्थो ब्रह्मैवाहमस्मि ब्रह्मैवाहमस्मि। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। ॐ पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। ॐ ईशावास्यमिदं सर्वं यत्किञ्च जगत्यां जगत् तेन त्यक्तेन भुञ्जीथा मा गृधः कस्य स्विद्धनं कुर्वन्नेवेह कर्माणि जिजीविषेच्छतं समाः। एवं त्वयिनान्यथेतोऽस्ति न कर्म लिप्यते नरे। असुर्यानामते लोका अन्धेन तमसावृताः तांस्ते प्रेत्याभिगच्छन्ति ये केचात्महनो जनाः। अनेजदेकं मनसो जवीयो नैनद्देवा आप्नुवन् पूर्वमर्षत् तद्धावतोऽन्यानत्येति तिष्ठत् तस्मिन्नपो मातरिश्वा दधाति। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। So, tasminnapो मातरिश्वा दधाति. In our previous session, we discussed this last sentence from this mantra. I tried to explain the idea of Matarishva. I'll conclude by saying that Matarishva is the wind or the breath of life which generates fire in this fire heat in this body. This is where I left the discussion in the previous Upanishad class. And that is what relates also the idea to the name of the Greek version of Matarishva, Prometheus, which is related to the Sanskrit root Matha, to which English word should we use for this action? Friction? Churning, yes, churning. Mathid yadim bibhrito Matarishva. Matarishva, as it enters grihe grihe, every body, every home, and this body, deha eva gehastha, deha, the body, is seen like the abode, like the home in which consciousness abides. Sometimes the body is compared to a house, sometimes it is compared to a city of 9 gates. For example, in the word Purusha, Pur means city, the entity which rests, which abides, which lives, consciousness which lives in the city, and by this the word city, Pura, we mean this body. And sometimes the body is also compared to Geha, a home. So Grihe Grihe, in every home, in every body, Matarishva, this Matarishva, Mathit, it churns the life of fire into existence, Shyeto Jinyo Abhut. Then that radiant fire of which I talked, Vaishvanara, which is known as Vaishvanara in the Vedic understanding, that arises in the physical body. So basically, I think this idea of the life of breath is an extremely cross-cultural idea. It is also found, for example, in the Genesis. There is this beautiful verse that, "And the Lord God formed man of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." So that breath of life, that is what the word Matarishva stands for. Now, like Prometheus in the Greek culture, which is explained by Greek philosophers as forethought, similarly there is a philosophical understanding behind Matarishva, which I explained a little bit, actually in quite a great detail when I was talking about Sutratma, the all-threading principle, the principle that threads all living entities together. What is it? How does Vedanta philosophy explain this? How does Vedanta philosophy sees it within the awareness, within the consciousness of an individual? Because everything that Vedantic masters talk about, even their world view, their explanation of the universe out there, is based on what they have experienced within themselves. That is how they have explained it, because that is what they had access to through meditation, through introspection, through analyzing the experiences within themselves, what is happening within themselves. So, in the Vedantic understanding, there are these 3 potentials in consciousness The Sanskrit word for potential is Shakti, the capability. Because Shakti is translated as, sometimes it is translated as energy, as force, as power. But the Sanskrit root Shak, for example, when I say, can you come to the class? Shaknoti bhavan agantum. The root Shak is used. Are you capable of coming? So the root Shak is used in the sense of capability, to be capable of. So Shakti is the capability, the potential. For example, the potential that is there in the tiny little seed to become such a big tree. That is Shakti. So that is what the word Shakti means. So in consciousness, there are these three potentials. One is Jnana Shakti, the potential to know, the potential to experience. Then Kriya Shakti, the potential to act. And Ichha Shakti, the potential to will. And usually the sequence is Janati, a person knows, then Ichhati, then he desires, and then eventually Karoti, he does. This is the sequence: knows, desires, and does. If we look through our modern physiological understanding, for example, then roughly speaking, what we know, because there are these three categories of neurons in our nervous system. So the first one, sensory neurons, by which information, the flow of sensation from the peripheral nervous system, from the eyes, from all the different sense modalities, reaches the central nervous system, and with that into consciousness. These neurons, they are known as the sensory neurons. Then the second group of neurons are known as motor neurons, which carry instruction from the brain and the spinal cord into the peripheral nervous system, and from there to the muscles and to the glands. So these are the motor neurons. And then the third one, which are known as the interneurons, or sometimes also referred to as the association neurons. They are the ones that are interspersed between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, and therefore transmit our will, our volition to our muscles, and to all, and hence all the activities happen. So Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti, and Ichha Shakti, these three Shaktis are seen as potentials which ultimately, in the understanding of Vedanta, manifest when consciousness abides in this body. So the idea is that pure consciousness ultimately on its own, and this is an important point for Advaita Vedanta, when we speak of pure consciousness in its purest essence, then even these Shaktis have no meaning. Because these Shaktis, these capabilities only become fully manifest when consciousness comes in contact with the physical body. So it is something like, in the understanding of Vedanta, I've been talking about this idea of upadhi, this idea of a limiting adjunct, this idea that the coloring of a crystal, when it comes in contact of a red surface, it seems like it seemingly becomes red, but in reality it doesn't. The moment the surface is removed, it is again pure transparent. So similarly, this potential that arises in consciousness is what Vedantins would say upadhikrita. Upadhikrita means caused by these limiting adjuncts, if we can translate the word upadhi as limiting adjunct. Sometimes it is very difficult to translate, and even these translated words don't convey the idea unless we are familiar with the whole concept altogether. But at some point we will have to become familiar, and these ideas keep on coming back again and again when we study Vedanta. So the idea of the nervous system, which to the Upanishadic masters was known as hita in plural, the Sanskrit word for the internal nervous system through which consciousness travels in all the different parts of the body, which has been talked about in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The word that is used there is hita in plural. So it is when it comes in contact with these that these potentials arise, and it is specifically the potential to act, Kriya Shakti, the potential of action, for which the inspiration, the ultimate inspiration, comes from consciousness. Without consciousness, if we are not conscious, we cannot act meaningfully. But of course, that potential does not manifest till the entire nervous system is present to allow that potential to fully manifest. So it is always this interplay between Prakriti, between nature, whether you call it Prakriti in the Sankhya Yoga term or you call it Maya in the Vedantic term on one hand, and on the other hand it is Purusha, pure consciousness. It is always the interplay between a manifestation, a form that arises out of nature, out of Prakriti, and consciousness, these two, that a new manifestation takes place. And in this case, that potential to act in consciousness, that is what, in the understanding of Vedanta, Matarishva ultimately would stand for. That potential to act, that potential which inspires action in every human being, that is what the word Matarishva ultimately, Tasmin Napo Matarishva, but that Matarishva which bears all activities, which makes that potential which manifests and which ultimately gives rise to all our actions, that potential, even that potential has its basis, has its foundation in pure consciousness. This is the idea that is being presented in this sentence. So there are three things: Tasmin, pure consciousness; Madarishva, the potential to act in it; and then Apaha, action. These three things. The later two things, action and the potential to act, both ultimately have their origin, their source in pure consciousness, in what Maharshi Dadhyangatharvana, the seer of Ishavasya Upanishad, calls Atman, the self, the entity that he is talking about, the entity of which the experience he is describing. So with this we can proceed now to the next mantra. Let us pronounce it first and then we will understand it. The fifth verse. Tadejati, tadejati, तदेजति तन्नैजति 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 तद्दूरे 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 तद्वन्तिके 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 तदन्तरस्य 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 सर्वस्य 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 तदु 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 सर्वस्यास्य 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 बाह्यतः 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 तदेजति तन्नैजति तद्दूरे तदवन्तिके तदन्तरस्य सर्वस्य तदु सर्वस्यास्य बाह्यतः. Yes. Now, having talked about this potential of movement, what this shloka says about Atman, about that self, about that inner consciousness, tadejati. This mantra is not saying radically something different from what has already been expressed in the previous verse. In the previous mantra it was stated that anejat, it is unmoving. But then the question comes, if Atman is unmoving, if that pure consciousness is unmoving, then do we have two entities in this world? Is the creation, is the universe divided into these two radically separate entities, the moving entity and the unmoving entity? Is that what you mean? That question would arise. If pure consciousness is unmoving, it is the foundation of all movement, then is movement itself different from consciousness? That means you have already accepted the idea of duality. Then that non-dual existence, that fundamental assertion of the Upanishadic teachings that this universe is a mass of consciousness, and there is just one entity. I think the expression, the teaching that is there in the Upanishad, ekam eva advitiyam, ekam, one, eva, only, and advitiyam, not two. Now each word says the same thing. Ekam means one, it is the same thing. Eva, only, so only also says the same thing. And then advitiyam, not two, non-dual. Dvitiya means second, and advitiya means the one to whom there is no second. That is what advitiya means. So all the three words that have been used ultimately seem to mean the same thing. But then why are these three words being used? Because in the perceivable world there are three types of differences, three types of distinctions. One difference that is there is the difference between two objects that belong to different categories, such as the difference between a tree and a stone, for example. This is the most basic difference, the difference between the tree and the stone. Completely different. They are two completely different entities. That is the first type of difference. Then the second type of difference would be the difference that is there between two trees. Both are trees, both are belong also to the same family, both are mango trees, for example, but yet, despite both are mango trees, there is still some difference between these two. So that is the second type of difference. And the third type of difference is within one mango tree itself. For example, the root is different from the branches, the leaves are different from the stem, and like this, the individual difference that is there within the tree itself. So there are three types of differences, and it is these three types of differences that are completely being negated. Neither there is anything else which is radically different from pure consciousness. There are no two pure consciousnesses, and there is no individual difference between, you would say, pure consciousness here and pure consciousness there. There is like in a tree. All these three types of differences have been completely negated. And therefore the ultimate conclusion of the Upanishadic masters is always Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma. All this is pure consciousness. Everything that we perceive, including the perceiver, the process of perception, and the objects being perceived, all is ultimately pure consciousness at all and nothing else. So the moment you ascertain something as the unmoving entity which was done, but that was just for the sake of awareness, to realize it as it is in its purest essential nature, as it would be devoid of all momentary movement, because movement is momentary. And as long as we understand it in the relation of momentary movement, we will not be capable of understanding its immortal, infinite, in time and space nature, timeless nature. For that, we have to understand it as it would be devoid of all these momentary qualities. And therefore, for the sake of explanation, for the sake of teaching, the master said, Anejat. It is unmoving. But then what is that which is moving? Is it different from that? No. Tadejati. Therefore now he says, the same entity is also moving. Even though it is completely unmoving at the very foundation, all movement that we see in this world is also happening within that. So Tadejati means, Tat means that, and Ejati means move. And how do you explain these two contradictory statements? The example that the Vedantic commentators and masters usually give here is that, just think about the space that is there within a pot. Now the pot was kept here, you move it here. Has the space in the pot moved? If you look at it as being limited by that pot, and if you are just completely talking about the space that is enveloped by the pot, then yes, that space has moved from here to here, because now the space here is no more limited by the pot, but the space here now is limited, so it has moved from here to here. Movement has occurred. So very well you could say that like the ghata, like the pot has moved, ghatakasha, the space within that pot has also moved. But is that the reality? Yes, we can say it. But is that the reality? Can space really move Is there a place where space can go, where it is already not present? It has no space where it can move. Every atom of that ghata, of that pot, is actually consists mostly of space. So what we see as that solid object is actually filled with space. So how can it move from here to here? This movement is an illusion. Yet we are seeing it. We are talking about it. And when we talk about it, it gives us an understanding as if it actually has moved. Yet it doesn't. In that sense, movement, that seeming movement can easily be termed an illusion. Illusion is something which seems to be there but is in reality not there. So that is how this statement would be explained. Tadejati, that entity moves. If you look at it, if you perceive it in relation to its limiting adjuncts, like now space, when you look at it in relation to its limiting adjunct, which is that pot, then yes, it has moved. Then it moves from here to here. But without that, there is no movement at all. So this is the second statement, tan ejati. Tat, that, na, not, ejati, moves. And it is in such mutually contradicting statements that the overarching truth is ultimately reconciled. Because if words are like this, that the moment you use a word, you have only expressed one side of the reality. The other side of the reality remains unexpressed. The only way to express both sides of reality, both faces of reality, is to do it by such mutually contradicting statements, which give us a sense of the overarching truth, the reconciling truth, which reconciles both mutually contradicting statements. So for example, like substances, created substances can either be positively charged or negatively charged. But what about the electrical field that is between both of them? What about that? So, even though it is unmoving itself, it is equally true to say that every movement that takes place in this universe is only possible because of it and is happening in it. It is that entity that the Upanishadic masters are speaking about. Sometimes they use the word Atman for it. Sometimes they use the word Prana for it. For example, in Kathopanishad, there is one sentence, Yadidam kincha Jagat Sarvam Prana Ejati Nisritam. This entire moving creation, which is constantly on move, the whole world, only moves in that prana. Now the word prana, for what is it being used? For the same entity, for the same Atman that the Upanishadic masters are talking about. There is often a lot of insistence, for example, in Vedantic philosophy, there is a lot of insistence on describing that pure consciousness as Sat, as pure presence. But then what about absence? On the other hand, in Shunyavada philosophies, in the Buddhistic philosophies, there is a lot of insistence on describing it as Asat, as shunya, as non-being, as the complete void. But these are mere philosophical insistence for the sake of philosophical explanation, philosophical deliverance, for philosophical thinking. the overarching truth that has been beautifully expressed in some places of the Upanishads and some places in the Vedas. Either, for example, in Mundaka Upanishad, Sadasad Varenyam, that ultimate choosable entity, the same word Varenya, which is also in the Gayatri mantra, Om Bhurbhuva Swaha Tatsavitur Varenyam Bhargaha, that ultimately that light which should be chosen above everything else, that is what Varenya means, the choosable, the one that should be chosen above everything else, because that is the very foundation. That is Sadasat. Beautifully, both words have been used. Sat, pure existence, and Asat, non-existence. So there are statements in the Upanishad, Sadeva Saumyadamagrasid, this entire creation was pure existence in the beginning. Then you will find in Taittiriya Upanishad, you will find statements, Asadevedamagra Asit, this entire creation was pure non-existence in the beginning. Then you find this statement, Sadasat, it was both pure existence and pure non-being. And then in some of the most ancient creation hymns of the Rig Veda, you will find a negation of both. Na sadasit, no sadasit. Neither it was pure presence, nor it was pure absence. So what are the masters doing here? Sometimes expressing it like this, sometimes expressing it like that. A philosopher, someone who thinks, who will try to analyze this rationally in his philosophical system, he will find it extremely difficult. But someone who relates to it from his own experience and realizes that the words that are being used for an entity which in reality cannot be expressed in words in its totality. Words at best can only express a part of it, and the moment we express a part of it, we describe a part of it remains undescribed. And that is the limitation of the words. So to get rid of these limitations, the masters sometimes come up with these mutually contradicting terms, but Indologists, for example, don't understand it. So they would say, oh my God, how can one teacher, how can one master teach such mutually contradicting teachings? At one place he's saying it's pure non-existence, then he says pure existence, then he says this, then he says that. It cannot be, they are completely different. They are completely mutually contradictory. The Upanishadic teachings have no common foundation. They state some teachings that are completely mutually exclusive, contradictory. But in Vedanta, it is explained in Vedanta, we understand that these mutually exclusive statements are what give us a sense of the vastness, of the infinity, of the principle that the masters are talking about. So yes, tadejati, tanna ejati, that moves not. Taddure, that is extremely far. Dura means far, tat, that. That is the entity which is extremely far, and tadu antike, and it is also the same entity which is extremely near, extremely close at hand. Extremely far for someone who is searching it out there, and because it is extremely subtle, it cannot be found out there, because what we find out there is just the surface. Our senses are capable of registering change, registering movement. So we just register the changing forms and action, nama, rupa, and kriya. Either our reactions to the external objects, or the form of external objects, and action. These are the three things. And these are constantly changing. These are constantly in a state of flux. What underlies that has to be thought about, that has to be meditated about. That cannot be seen through the senses. That unchanging reality, that cannot be seen. And for that, a person has to search within himself. That is why I keep on quoting again and again this mantra from the Rig Veda, that when Asme Vatsam Parishantam Navindan, that beloved fire about which the masters had told their students that it exists all around us, Icchantaha, they wanted to experience it. Yet all these wise men, they could not find it out there. Shrama Yuvaha, however effort they made, Padavyaha, they searched for it everywhere. But then Dhyamdhaha, when they still the mind, when they hold their mind, when they allow it to become still, then Tasthuh Pade Parame Charu Agnehe, they realized that they were already sitting, they were already established in what they were searching. They were already in it. And these ideas, I think they exist in all the different cultures. For example, in the Taoist traditions of China, adepts often search for their divine teachers in all the holy mountains of China, ultimately only to discover it in the palaces that they find within themselves. That is how it is expressed in the Taoistic tradition. So they search for them in all the holy mountains of China, but then ultimately only find that divine teacher in the palaces that is within them. So this is how the language of the mystic is always the same. As Saint Martin puts it, that all mystics speak the same language and come from the same country. So taddure tadu antike, and the same entity is close at hand. Not only close at hand, like the Quran puts it, that Allah is closer to you than your jugular vein. That is the expression that is there in the Quran. Closest, it is closest because it is what you are. It is the very self, the very core of our being. So therefore, elsewhere, here it has not been made clear that someone who perceives it, someone who experiences it, for him it is his own self, his own core of his being. Elsewhere in the Upanishad, Durat Sudure, it is further than the farthest entity in this universe. But Pashyatsu, for a conscious being who meditates, who searches for it within himself, Ihaiva Nihitam Guhayam, it is hidden within the cave that is there within us, in the cavity of the heart. Pashyatsu Nihitam Guhayam, it is hidden within this cavity within. So taddure tadavantike tadantarasya sarvasya tadu sarvasyasya bahyatah, it is the same entity which is within all this and which is indeed also out of all this. So that is the two meanings of the word Vishnu. Today when we hear the word Vishnu, just a particular form comes into our mind, which has a deep symbolical significance. But what does the word Vishnu itself, the Sanskrit word Vishnu, mean? Vish, the root Vish. There are two Sanskrit roots. One is pronounced as Vish and one is pronounced as Vish. Vish, Sha and Sha. this difference of letter is there. One root, vish with sha, means to enter. Those who know Hindi, they can relate. Pravesha. Pravesha. Pravesha means to enter, entrance. So that root vish means to enter. So that is one meaning. And the other root vish means to pervade, to be present everywhere. So both meanings are there in the word Vishnu. The entity which has entered everything, that is Vishnu, and the entity which pervades everything, which envelops everything, that is Vishnu. So the word, that is what the master is stating here. Tadantarasya sarvasya, that entity which exists within all, at the core of everyone's being, and tadu sarvasyasya bahyataha, it is also the entity which is outside all this, because it is omnipresent like infinite space. The only way we can make sense of these teachings is always when we understand it with the example of space. Space is within and space is without. It is within everything. At the core of every atom, what lies is just space. It is within everything, and then if it is within everything, then what is out there? Out there, it is also space. And therefore, the Upanishadic masters are fond of speaking of this material space as the body of pure consciousness. Akasha Shariram Brahma. One of the Upanishadic statements is that Akasha Shariram Brahma. This infinite space is the body of Brahman, of pure consciousness. Or the concluding mantra of this Upanishad. The book that you have here belongs to the Kanva recension of the Shukla Yajurveda. If a person looks into the Madhyandina recension of the same Veda, then the concluding mantra is Om Kham Brahma. Om, Brahman, absolute pure consciousness, is infinite space. So like infinite space, which is within everything and which is without everything, in the same way, pure consciousness, that Atman, that self, that the Upanishadic masters are talking about, is to be understood. We'll come back to this Tadantarasya sarvasya tadu sarvasyasya bahyataha in the next discussion, touch a little bit more and try to make sense of this, discuss it in greater detail. Let us, any questions, any thoughts, any observation? Yes?
About the pure consciousness, if we talk, for example, about the Akash space, will it be correct to use the word Akash for pure consciousness, or Akash is just like the space without the sense of conscious that has Atman?
Yeah. Actually, in some of the Upanishadic teachings, the word Akasha has been used for pure consciousness as well. And that is what causes a little bit of confusion, whether now by the word Akasha, do we mean physical space or do we mean pure consciousness? Which physical space cannot exist in the absence of pure consciousness. That is not possible. But pure consciousness can exist in the absence of space, because in the understanding of Vedanta, like in our modern understanding today, even space is a created entity, which is created within pure consciousness. So when we talk of physical space, so physical space cannot be in the absence of pure consciousness, nothing can, but pure consciousness can be there in the absence of physical space. So yes, coming back to your question, that leads to some confusion sometimes, because when the word Akasha is used in the Upanishads in the context of Brahman, does it now mean pure consciousness or does it mean physical space? So this has such confusing questions have been discussed in great detail in a text known as Brahma Sutra, the Brahma Sutras. So there is, for example, a sutra, Akasha Stallingat. Akasha in these particular mantras has been used in the meaning of pure consciousness and not in the sense of physical space. Why? Then all the reasons are given there. So yes, the word Akasha sometimes in the Upanishads has been used, but no explanation has been provided. So the later masters, what they did, they really went into detail and tried to pinpoint the places in the Upanishads where the word Akasha has been used for pure consciousness alone, and not this interchange of words by the Upanishadic masters sometimes becomes a little bit confusing, but confusing only on the initial level. Later on, when a person has studied it, then it becomes actually beautiful, because then you realize that these statements, Om Kam Brahma Kam Brahma, beautiful statements, that pure bliss is pure consciousness, infinite space is pure consciousness. And what do they mean by bliss and infinite space and pure consciousness? Why have these expressions been put together? What is the quintessence of that? All these discussions are beautiful discussions, and you see a lot more in those expressions than you would if you would just read a literal translation. Then they become really like formulas expressing deeper truths. That becomes the beauty of the Upanishadic expressions. Yes, any other? Something that you struggle with, should really let me know, because sometimes it becomes difficult for me to know where you struggle. So if you struggle in understanding something, if you struggle in making sense of something, then you should let me know, so that I can address it, I can come to that idea again and try to explain it if I understand it myself.
Maybe you can give an example that you give with the pot moving for the moves and not moves not too far and near. Maybe you can give another example.
Okay. An example to what is extremely the farthest entity and the closest entity. Any entity that is extremely far, even the farthest entity that I don't know what is the farthest entity that we have discovered with the science, with our scientific understanding, but even that entity within this universe, however far it might be, it is still a manifestation of that consciousness. And the closest is the entity within us, this pure consciousness. This is the closest. So it is further away even than that farthest entity which we can think of, which we can perceive. Back then it was the stars. All they could see were the stars in the night. They were the farthest entities. And yet, what lies beyond that? What is that? That is the same entity. So it is durat sudure, further than the farthest, and tadihantikecha, and is closer than the closest. Closest is our body, yet it is even closer than that. Closest is our mind, our thoughts. This is even closer than that, because it is the witness of our thoughts, of every thought that comes up. It is that we are talking about that consciousness which is which is witnessing, which is present within that within that thought. Otherwise, every thought it is present. Otherwise, how would we become aware of those thoughts? The content changes from thought to thought, but consciousness doesn't. In every thought, consciousness is present. Contents change. So, the consciousness that is there within these closest thoughts, that would be the example of the closest entity. And for the example of the farthest entity, we can take the stars, we can take anything that is extremely far out there.
And any time you want to use a telescope, you always have to fit it to your eye.
Yes.
So it's really just
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Everything that we see, even the farthest entity, we are seeing it. The conscious self is seeing it. The conscious self is seeing it. Yes.
This sounds like a bulletproof, like a perfect verse. So it just covers everything. However you think about it, it's just back to the same point that in that perfection of the actual words that are used here. Because when you think about that, it is omnipresent and it's also inside, it's outside. It could be stagnant.
It could be
stagnant, immovable,
Yeah.
unchangeable.
Yes.
But it could also be in flux. It could be within, it could
Yes.
be without.
Yes.
It could be before, it could be after. So whether the Big Bang theory is right or wrong, that the universe expands, the galaxies move away from each other, so they are moving, or they are static, they are not moving, that also covers that. So it's like, that sums everything up. So then, you know, when you read about theories and ideas and philosophies, and then you're like, okay, maybe they are wrong. But this one is like perfect. It's perfect. It covers everything. So it's kind of annoying.
It's kind of annoying. Is perfect annoying? Is because we
We lead an imperfect life.
we lead an imperfect life. Yes. Yeah.
It's sort of like annoying in its simplicity, because for us, mortals, life is complex.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it is simple and it's most likely doable. I do not doubt that it's not doable, but it's annoying. I really want to say that it is simplicity.
In its simplicity. Yes, yes. But the deeper you go, the simpler the truths become. I mean, that is we know that now very well with our scientific understanding. The deeper a person goes, the simpler the descriptions become. And yes, at the core, Vedanta is extremely simple. Yes. And we have to accept it.
in its dissection, it becomes very complex.
Yeah, in its dissection it becomes
It's
very
almost
complex.
Like when I think about the complexities and the way you so eloquently explain it, it kind of it twists my brain and then it
Yeah.
hurts, and then when I kind of drop that away, just feel it, it feels,
Exactly.
and that's okay. to
Yes,
do.
perfectly, perfect, because that is actually the process. First of all, we speak of Shravana, we speak of listening, then we speak of Manana, of trying to make sense of it, thinking about logically about its complexities, and then the last level is Nididhyasana, actually to feel it, to experience it, where there is no complexity at all. It is just a fundamental experience, that's all. And whether the Buddha expresses it in slightly different words, the Upanishadic masters express it in slightly different words. We saw that this apparent difference in expression is just a difference in expression. Ultimately, it comes to the experience. That is the most important thing. Till that doesn't happen, then if we don't relate it from our own experience, then it is philosophical brainstorming, philosophical mental twisting. But change in life occurs when a person, inner development occurs when a person actually relates with it. And that is what happens when a person meditates, when a person contemplates and relates with it from his own experience. Yes, so yes, that is the most important thing.
Experience is I don't know how you, like, I don't know if I'm experiencing anything. All I know is that when I dissect it, it hurts my head, and when I just, like, when it permeates me, and it's a different understanding, and then I feel that it's true. But I don't know what I'm experiencing.
Yeah. Of course, by experiencing it objectively, like I experience, I'm experiencing this through my senses, or I'm experiencing my thoughts. The experience is not of this kind. The experience is rather, because I'm experiencing these thoughts, the entity that is experiencing these thoughts, that is the entity that I'm talking about. So it is more like not an objective experience, but a subjective experience. And in that sense, even the quality of its experience is radically different from any other experience, because everything else that we experience it as an object, and the entity that we are talking about can only be experienced, can never be experienced in its purest form as an object, but only as the subject of all the experiences that are taking place. So I'm just trying to express it in words. But think about it, it makes sense. And the more we think about it, the more it starts making sense. And whether we think about it from modern perspectives of psychology, again, when they start dealing with consciousness, you realize that they start using the same language that the Upanishadic masters have already used. Exactly the same language. You cannot express it in another way. So yes, the modern work that is there now, which especially the work that was produced after the year 2000 in the field of consciousness is amazing. It's really amazing. And when we look at it then, and in the light of that understanding, then the Upanishadic teachings really start making sense. Yeah. So yes, this is like we practice asana every day. We try to go deeper and deeper into a posture, and then ultimately using that posture, using the depth of that posture to go deeper within our own self. It is the same way. What are we? We are twisting and turning and churning our mind in the same way like we are twisting our body. But why are we doing this? What is the ultimate purpose? The ultimate purpose is to create an awareness of the witness of all that mind content. All these thoughts. Ultimately, it is not about these thoughts. It is about the entity which becomes aware of these thoughts, but it is awareness itself. It is not an entity that that is different and is becoming aware of these thoughts. But it is simply, you can say, you can express it differently, and you can say that it is present within every thought as awareness. That's it. So the Sanskrit word Chaitanya, which is translated as awareness, it is not an entity which has awareness, but it is awareness itself that we are talking about. Chit, sometimes in Satchidananda, Sat, pure existence, Chit, pure awareness. And Ananda, the entity which does not lack anything, in which everything is present, which doesn't lack. Yes, Ananda is translated as pure bliss, but that is the grammatical meaning of the word Ananda, which doesn't lack, and it doesn't lack anything because it is the very foundation, and everything is seen to exist within it as potential, so it doesn't lack anything. Everything that ever arose, arises today, and will arise in the future, arises from that, in that. So let us conclude with this short prayer. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः।